I died at 32 in a military hospital bed, my body ravaged by sepsis that should have been caught days earlier. My husband, Major Dr. Chen Wei, was in the doctor's lounge with Captain Nurse Lin Yu, the woman he'd been having an affair with for 3 years, discussing their upcoming transfer to a better posting together. The last thing I heard before my organs began shutting down was a nurse outside my door telling someone, "Mrs. Chen's condition is critical. Should I page Dr. Chen?" The response, "He's in an important meeting. It can wait." It couldn't wait. I died 20 minutes later, alone except for that same nurse who held my hand and cried while my husband planned his future with another woman. My name is Su Lin, and I spent 10 years being Major Dr. Chen Wei's perfect military wife, hosting dinners for his superiors, volunteering at the base hospital, raising our daughter alone during his deployments, forgiving every affair and every broken promise because I believed that's what good military wives did. I believed that sacrifice meant love, that forgiveness meant strength, that enduring meant winning. I believed wrong. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in a morgue or heaven. I was 22, standing in my childhood bedroom, wearing the red qipao my mother had bought for my wedding day. Through the door, I could hear relatives arriving, my mother fussing about the banquet arrangements, my father's nervous laughter. In 6 hours, I would marry Chen Wei. In 10 years, I would die because of him. Not this time. I walked out of my room and found my mother arranging flowers in the living room. She looked younger than I remembered, her hair still mostly black, her face unlined by the worry I'd cause her over the next decade. "Mama, I need to talk to you." She turned, smiling. "Su Lin, you should be getting ready. The hair and makeup artist will be here in an hour." "I'm not getting married today." Her smile froze. "What?" "I'm not marrying Chen Wei. I'm calling off the wedding." My mother's face went through shock, confusion, and then something that looked like relief before she composed herself. "Su Lin, this is just nerves. Every bride feels. It's not nerves. I know things about Chen Wei that I can't ignore, things that mean this marriage would be a mistake." "What things?" I couldn't tell her I'd lived through 10 years of this marriage already, that I knew Chen Wei would have affairs with at least 4 different women during our marriage, that he would drain our joint account to support his mistress, that he would neglect our daughter so badly she'd end up in therapy by age 8, that his medical negligence would eventually kill me. But I could tell her enough. He's already seeing someone else. A nurse at the military hospital where he's posted. Captain Lin Yu. My mother sat down heavily. "How do you know this?" "I found letters, messages, photos, all of which existed in my previous timeline and probably existed now, if I knew where to look. They've been together for months. He's planning to marry me for the housing allowance and dependent benefits while continuing his relationship with her." This was true. In my previous timeline, Chen Wei had told me years into our marriage that he'd only married me because single officers under 30 couldn't live off base, and marriage to a suitable woman like me, educated, from a good family, willing to play the role, had been career advancement. My mother's face had gone pale. "If this is true, we need to confront him. We need to. We need to cancel the wedding. Not confront him. Not give him a chance to explain or apologize. Just end it." I kept my voice firm. "I won't marry someone who's using me. But the guests, the deposits, the shame will be less than the shame of marrying a man who doesn't love me and spending the next decade being humiliated." My father appeared in the doorway. "What's going on?" My mother looked at him, then at me. "Su Lin has information that Chen Wei is unfaithful. She wants to call off the wedding." I watched my father's face carefully. In my previous timeline, my parents had loved Chen Wei, admired his career, his status as a military doctor, his apparent respectability. They'd encouraged me to overlook his flaws, to be understanding of his stresses, to support him unconditionally. Now my father's expression hardened. If he's unfaithful before marriage, he'll be unfaithful during marriage. Cancel it. But my mother started. Cancel it, my father repeated. Our daughter's dignity is worth more than avoiding embarrassment. 2 hours later, my father had called the Chen family and informed them the wedding was off. Chen Wei showed up at our house within 30 minutes, still in his military uniform, his face a mask of confused outrage. "Sir, with respect, I don't understand what's happening," he said to my father. "Has Su Lin said something? If there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I said, stepping into the room before my father could respond. "I know about Captain Lin Yu." Chen Wei's face went completely blank. A look I'd seen dozens of times in my previous life when he was caught in a lie. "I don't know who that is." "She's a nurse at your hospital. You've been seeing her for 6 months. You were planning to marry me while continuing your relationship with her." "That's absurd. Where would you even get such an idea?" His voice was perfectly calibrated. Hurt, confused, slightly offended. "Su Lin, I know wedding nerves can make people paranoid, but accusing me of—" "I have proof," I said, bluffing. "Letters. Messages. Photos. Would you like me to show them to my parents? Or would you prefer to leave with dignity?" Something shifted in Chen Wei's expression. Not guilt. He was too practiced at lying for guilt. But calculation. He was weighing his options, trying to figure out if I was bluffing and what his best move was. Even if I had been friendly with a colleague, which isn't a crime, it would be nothing compared to what we have, he said, switching tactics to wounded nobility. "Su Lin, I love you. Whatever you think you know, whatever someone has told you to make you doubt me, it's not worth throwing away our future. We don't have a future. Please leave." Chen Wei looked at my father, man to man, military to military. "Sir, surely you understand that relationships in the service can be complicated. Sometimes people misinterpret professional closeness as something more. I would never dishonor Su Lin or your family." "My daughter asked you to leave," my father said. "So leave." After Chen Wei left, my mother collapsed into a chair. "What have we done? His family is going to be furious." "The gossip." "Let them be furious," my father said. "Better this than watching our daughter suffer in a bad marriage." I hugged my father, feeling tears I'd kept contained finally breaking free. In my previous life, my father had died 5 years into my marriage, never knowing how unhappy I was, how much I'd needed his support. This time he was standing with me from the beginning. Over the next week, the fallout was brutal but manageable. The Chen family demanded an explanation, threatening legal action over the cancelled deposits. My father told them simply that the couple had proven incompatible, and if they wanted to make an issue of it, he'd be happy to discuss Chen Wei's conduct publicly. They backed down. The social consequences were harder. People whispered that I'd gotten cold feet, that I was too picky, that I'd ruined a good match over nothing. A few relatives stopped speaking to us, embarrassed by the scandal. But I noticed something interesting. Several women my age, women who'd been friendly with me before, started reaching out, calling to check on me, inviting me for coffee. And in those quiet conversations, they'd mention their own experiences with men like Chen Wei. The military boyfriends or husbands who'd had affairs, who'd been controlling, who'd used marriage for benefits while giving nothing back. "You're brave," one woman told me over tea. "Most of us just accepted it. Told ourselves it was part of being a military wife." "It doesn't have to be," I said. 3 months after the cancelled wedding, I was working at my father's law firm as a paralegal, a job I'd given up in my previous timeline to focus on being a military wife, when my mother called. "You need to see this," she said. She'd sent me a news article. Major Dr. Chen Wei had been reprimanded for fraternization with a subordinate officer, Captain Nurse Lin Yu. An investigation had revealed they'd been conducting an inappropriate relationship for over a year, violating military conduct policies. Both had been formally counseled and would face career consequences. Someone had reported them. I suspected it was someone at the hospital who'd known about Chen Wei's planned wedding and been disgusted by his conduct. 2 weeks later, I received a letter. Not from Chen Wei, from his mother. "Miss Su, I am writing to apologize for my son's behavior and to beg you to reconsider your decision. Chen Wei has made terrible mistakes, but he is willing to change. He has ended his relationship with that nurse and accepted his punishment. He still loves you and wants to make things right. Please, for the sake of what you once meant to each other, give him another chance." I read the letter twice, feeling nothing but cold clarity. This was the pattern I'd lived through for 10 years. Chinwei making terrible mistakes, promising to change, everyone around him begging me to forgive him, to give him another chance, to be understanding. In my previous life, I'd always relented, always given that next chance, always believed this time would be different. I wrote back, Mrs. Chun, I appreciate your letter but my decision is final. Chinwei's mistakes weren't aberrations. They were choices that reflected his character. I wish him well, but I won't be part of his life. 6 months after the cancelled wedding, I'd passed my law school entrance exam and been accepted into a prestigious program. My previous timeline had been spent supporting Chinwei's medical career. This timeline would be spent building my own. I was celebrating with friends at a restaurant when Chinwei walked in with a group of military officers. Our eyes met across the room. He looked older, harder, and when he saw me laughing with my friends, something ugly crossed his face. He approached our table. Sulin, it's been a while. Chinwei. I kept my voice neutral. I heard you got into law school. Congratulations. The word sounded sour. Though I have to say, I'm surprised. I didn't think you had the discipline for something that demanding. My friends bristled, but I stayed calm. Thank you for your concern. I'm looking forward to the challenge. Are you seeing anyone? The question was abrupt, aggressive. That's not your business. I'm just asking. Since you're so concerned about honesty and appropriate behavior, I assume you'd have no problem answering a simple question. I stood up, forcing him to step back. I'm not concerned with your approval or your questions. Enjoy your evening. As I turned away, he grabbed my arm, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop me. You think you're better than me now? You think walking away made you some kind of hero? I think walking away made me free. Now let go of my arm. One of my friends, a guy named David who worked at my father's firm, stood up. She asked you to let go. Chinwei released me but didn't back down. Who's this? Your boyfriend? Didn't take you long to move on. What I do and who I spend time with is none of your concern. We have no relationship, Chinwei. We never really did. I gave you everything. You gave me nothing but lies and the expectation that I'd be grateful for them. I kept my voice low but clear. I'm done with this conversation. Don't approach me again. I walked out with my friends, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, but my head clear. David drove me home, checking several times to make sure I was okay. That guy seems like bad news, he said. He is. I was supposed to marry him. Seriously? What happened? I gave him the abbreviated version. The affair, the cancelled wedding, the aftermath. David listened without interrupting, and when I finished he just said, You made the right call. I know. But sometimes it's still hard. People act like I'm the one who made a mistake by leaving. Those people are wrong. You protected yourself. That's never a mistake. Over the next year, I threw myself into law school. The work was demanding but satisfying in a way my life with Chinwei never had been. I was building something that was entirely mine, learning skills that no one could take from me, creating a future based on my own capabilities rather than someone else's needs. I also noticed that David had started finding reasons to spend time with me. Bringing coffee when I was studying late at the firm, offering to help me prep for exams, inviting me to group activities that somehow always ended up being just the two of us. Are you asking me out? I finally said one evening when he'd suggested yet another casual dinner. He looked embarrassed. I didn't want to be presumptuous. I know you've been through a lot with your ex. David, I appreciate you being cautious. But I'm not made of glass. If you want to date, ask me properly. Okay. Sulin, would you like to go on an actual date with me? Not studying, not work-related, just a date? Yes, I would. Dating David was completely different from my relationship with Chinwei. David asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered details about my life and followed up on them. He had his own career and interests and never expected me to sacrifice mine for his. When we disagreed, we talked about it like adults instead of him sulking until I apologized for having opinions. It was so simple and so healthy that it took me months to trust it was real. You keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. David observed one night after I'd interrogated him about a female colleague he'd mentioned. I'm sorry. I know that's not fair to you. I'm not upset. I'm just noting that you don't fully trust me yet, which makes sense given your history. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. 2 years after the canceled wedding, I was in my final year of law school when my mother called with unexpected news. Sue Lin, I heard something through the Military Wives Network. You should know. What happened? Chun Wei is being investigated for medical malpractice. A patient died under his care, and her family is claiming negligence. Apparently, there are questions about whether he was properly monitoring her condition, or if he was distracted by personal matters. My blood ran cold. When did this happen? 2 months ago. But the investigation is just becoming public now. Do you know the patient's name? My mother was quiet for a moment. Why does that matter? Please, Mama. Do you know? Her name was Wang Mei. She was a military wife, died of sepsis. The family says it should have been caught earlier, but her assigned doctor wasn't paying attention. Wang Mei. In my previous timeline, that had been my name as Chun Wei's wife, Su Wang Mei, taking both family names as was sometimes done in military families. I'd died of sepsis, neglected by hospital staff who were too afraid of Chun Wei to question his orders. Su Lin, are you still there? I'm here. Thank you for telling me. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment trying to process what this meant. In my previous timeline, I'd been the one to die of neglect in Chun Wei's hospital. This time, someone else had died the same way. Chun Wei's pattern of negligence hadn't changed just because he didn't marry me. He'd simply found another victim. I called a contact I'd made during my law school internship, a journalist who covered military affairs. I have a story for you, I said, about systemic medical negligence at military hospitals and how certain doctors are protected because of their rank and connections. Over the next month, I provided the journalist with everything I could remember from my previous timeline. Dates of other suspicious deaths, patterns of complaints that had been dismissed, names of patients and families who'd been ignored or intimidated into silence. I couldn't prove most of it directly, but I could point the investigation in the right directions. The resulting article was explosive. It revealed that Chun Wei had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years, all of which had been quietly handled by the military to avoid scandal. Wang Mei's death hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of negligence and arrogance that the military had enabled. Chun Wei was court-martialed. During the proceedings, more victims came forward. Families of patients who'd died or been injured under his care, nurses who'd been pressured to cover up his mistakes, junior doctors he'd bullied into silence. Captain Lin Yu, his lover, testified that she'd repeatedly warned him about cutting corners on patient care, but that he'd dismissed her concerns. She was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. The shocking truth that emerged during the trial was worse than anyone had suspected. Chun Wei had been involved in a medical supply theft ring, stealing drugs and equipment from the military hospital to sell on the black market. His negligence with patients wasn't just arrogance, it was strategic. The sicker and more confused patients were, the less likely they were to notice discrepancies in their treatment or missing supplies. Wang Mei had died not just from sepsis, but from sepsis that had been deliberately left untreated because she'd started asking questions about her medication. Chun Wei had simply let her deteriorate until it was too late to save her. In my previous timeline, I died the same way, asking too many questions, noticing too many irregularities, becoming inconvenient to his criminal operation. He'd killed me, not in a moment of passion or accident, but through calculated medical negligence because I'd become a liability. The trial lasted 3 months. Chun Wei was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, medical malpractice, theft of military property, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 15 years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, and lifetime prohibition from practicing medicine. His mother showed up at my law firm one day near the end of the trial. "This is your fault," she said. "You ruined his life. If you'd just married him, been a good wife, supported him properly, none of this would have happened." "If I'd married him, I'd be dead," I said quietly. "Just like Wang Mei. Just like the other women who trusted him and paid with their lives." You have no proof he would have hurt you. I have every proof. He chose his criminal enterprise over patient safety. He killed people rather than risk exposure. What do you think he would have done to a wife who discovered his crimes? Mrs. Chen's face crumpled. He was a good boy. I raised him to be good. This isn't who he is. This is exactly who he is. And who he's always been. You just chose not to see it because acknowledging it would have been painful. After she left, David found me in my office, staring out the window. You okay? He asked. I keep thinking about the timeline where I married him. Where I ignored the warning signs and married him anyway, because that's what everyone expected. I'd be dead now. Or traumatized beyond repair. Or complicit in his crimes without knowing it. But that's not this timeline. In this timeline, you trusted your instincts and walked away. Do you ever wonder how I knew? I asked. How I knew to call off the wedding, how I knew he was dangerous, how I knew things I shouldn't have known. David was quiet for a moment. I've wondered. But I figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know. What if I told you I'd lived through it before? That I married him in another life, suffered through 10 years of abuse and neglect, and died because of his crimes? That I woke up on my wedding day with a chance to change it. I expected skepticism or concern. Instead, David just said, "Would you believe me if I said I suspected something like that?" I turned to look at him. What? You're too knowing, Sulin. Too certain about things you shouldn't know. Too careful in ways that don't match your age or experience. He smiled slightly. I'm not saying I fully understand it, or believe in reincarnation, or whatever this is. But I believe you experienced something that gave you foreknowledge. And I'm grateful you trusted it enough to save yourself. 3 years after the cancelled wedding, I graduated from law school at the top of my class. David and I had been dating seriously for over a year. My parents adored him. My father had already hinted heavily that he hoped David would join the family firm permanently. At my graduation party, my mother pulled me aside. I need to tell you something, she said. Something I should have told you years ago. What is it? When you called off the wedding to Chinwei, I was relieved. Genuinely relieved. Because I'd had doubts about him from the beginning. The way he talked about you more like a career asset than a person he loved. The way he seemed to be performing affection rather than feeling it. But I didn't say anything because I thought I was being overprotective, that I was seeing problems that didn't exist. Mama. Let me finish. When you had the courage to walk away based on your instincts, it taught me something crucial. A mother's job isn't to push her daughter toward what seems stable or respectable. It's to support her daughter in trusting herself. She gripped my hands. You saved yourself, Sulin. Not just from a bad marriage, but from a dangerous man. And I'm so proud of you for being strong enough to do it. I hugged my mother, crying into her shoulder. Thank you for believing me. Always. I'll always believe you. That night, David proposed. Not at the party, not in front of everyone, but later when we were alone in my apartment, exhausted and happy. I know this might seem fast, he said. And I know you have complicated feelings about marriage after everything with Chinwei. So I'm not asking for an immediate answer or a big wedding or any of the traditional expectations. I'm just asking. Would you consider building a life with me? Officially, legally, permanently? I looked at the ring, simple, elegant, completely different from the ostentatious one Chinwei had given me in my previous timeline. Yes, I said. But I need you to understand something first. Okay. I was married before. In another life, another timeline, whatever you want to call it. I was married to Chinwei for 10 years. I know what a bad marriage feels like, what it does to you, how it breaks you down piece by piece. So if I'm saying yes to you now, it's because I trust you in ways I never trusted him. But I'm also cautious in ways I never was before. And I need you to be patient with that. David pulled me close. I can be patient. Take all the time you need to feel safe. We don't have to set a date or make announcements or do anything until you're ready. We got married a year later in a small ceremony with just close family and friends. No military pomp, no performances for career advancement, no pretending to be something we weren't. Just two people who loved each other making a genuine commitment. At the reception, I saw my father talking to David's father, both of them laughing about something. My mother was dancing with David's mother. Friends from law school were mixing with David's colleagues from the firm. This was what a wedding should feel like: joyful, authentic, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about our happiness. Not like my first wedding in my previous timeline, which had been a performance for Chen Wei's military career, full of people I barely knew, focused on appearances rather than reality. 5 years after the cancelled wedding, I was a successful lawyer at my father's firm, specializing in military family law and medical malpractice. David and I had a 2-year-old daughter named Chenin, peaceful in Chinese because after everything I'd been through, peace was what I valued most. I was at the office working on a case when I got a call from the military prison, where Chen Wei was serving his sentence. "Mrs. Su," a voice said. "I'm calling because Chen Wei has requested to speak with you. He's being transferred to a medical facility due to health concerns, and he asked if you'd be willing to visit before the transfer." "Why would he want to see me?" "He says there are things he needs to tell you. Things about your cancelled wedding and what his plans had been." Every instinct screamed not to go, but I was curious. And I knew that seeing him now in prison, powerless and facing his consequences, might give me the final closure I needed. I went. Chen Wei looked terrible, gaunt gray, a decade older than his actual age. He was sitting in the visiting room when I arrived, shackled to the table despite being in a wheelchair. "Su Lin. Thank you for coming." "I'm here. What did you want to tell me?" He was quiet for a long moment. I wanted to apologize. And to explain. "I don't need an apology, but I'll listen to an explanation. When I planned to marry you, it wasn't just for the housing allowance or career benefits. It was because you were exactly the kind of wife who would never question me, never challenge me, never notice when things didn't add up." He laughed bitterly. I'd been running my medical supply scheme for 2 years by then. I needed a wife who'd be focused on supporting me, not investigating me. "So I was supposed to be your cover. You were supposed to be my insurance policy. A respectable lawyer's daughter, smart enough to be credible, but naive enough to be controlled. If anyone suspected me, having you as my wife would deflect suspicion." He leaned forward. "But then you called off the wedding. And I panicked. Because without you, I had to be more careful, hide things better. That's when I started getting sloppy. That's when people started dying. Don't blame your victims on me." "I'm not blaming you. I'm explaining that you saved yourself by walking away. If you'd married me, I would have eventually killed you. Not intentionally maybe, but inevitably. Because you're smart, Su Lin. Eventually you would have noticed the discrepancies, asked the wrong questions, become a problem I needed to eliminate." I sat with that for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm dying. Liver cancer, too far advanced to treat. I have maybe 6 months. And I wanted you to know that the life you built, the happiness you found, you earned it by trusting your instincts when everyone told you to ignore them." He smiled, and it was the first genuine expression I'd ever seen on his face. "You won, Su Lin. Completely and utterly. And I'm glad you did." "I didn't win anything. I just survived. In a game like ours, survival is winning." I left the prison feeling strange. Not validated, exactly, but confirmed in my choices. Chen Wei had admitted what I'd always suspected. That our relationship had never been about love or even attraction. It had been about control and exploitation from the very beginning. And I'd escaped. 6 months later, Chen Wei died in the prison medical facility. His mother contacted me asking if I'd attend the funeral. I declined. "He ruined lives," I told her. "He killed people." My sympathy died with his victims. 7 years after the cancelled wedding, I was sitting in my office when a young woman came in for a consultation. She was engaged to a military doctor, she said, but something felt wrong. He was pressuring her to quit her job, isolate from her friends, give him access to her bank accounts. "Everyone tells me I'm being paranoid," she said. "That military wives have to make sacrifices. That I need to trust him. But something in my gut says this isn't right." I looked at this young woman, barely 24, her whole life ahead of her, and saw myself at her age. "Tell me about these feelings," I said. "Every detail, every moment where you felt uncomfortable or uncertain. Don't minimize it, Don't explain it away. Just tell me. For the next hour, she described a pattern I recognized intimately. The isolation. The financial control. The dismissal of her concerns. The expectation that she sacrifice everything while he sacrificed nothing. Here's what I think, I said when she finished. I think your gut is telling you the truth. I think this man is dangerous. And I think you should call off the wedding. But everyone will think I'm crazy. Let them think that. Being alive and free is more important than being liked. Have you ever been in this situation? Yes. I was engaged to a military doctor once. I called off the wedding the day I was supposed to marry him. It was the best decision I ever made. What happened to him? He's dead now. But before he died, he killed several people through medical negligence and criminal activity. If I'd married him, I'd be one of those people. The young woman stared at me. How did you know? How did you know to walk away? I listened to my instincts. And I trusted that being cautious was better than being sorry. She called off her wedding 2 weeks later. Her fiancé tried to threaten her into reconsidering. She came back to me, and I helped her get a restraining order. 3 months later, he was arrested for the same medical supply theft scheme Chun-Wei had run. The investigation revealed he'd been mentored by Chun-Wei during his early career, and had taken over the operation after Chun-Wei's imprisonment. The pattern continued. The predators found new victims. But this time, one victim had escaped before becoming a casualty. 10 years after the cancelled wedding, I stood in my office looking at a wall of framed articles. Stories about military families fighting for justice. Investigations into medical malpractice. Profiles of women who'd escaped abusive situations. My law practice had evolved to focus entirely on these cases. I'd become known as the lawyer who believed victims, who fought institutional cover-ups, who wasn't afraid of powerful men in uniform. David came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. Thinking about how far you've come? Thinking about how far I could have fallen. How close I came to spending my life as Chun-Wei's victim instead of my own person. But you didn't. You chose yourself. And that choice changed everything. I turned in his arms to face him. Do you ever think about the timeline where I married him? Where I didn't trust my instincts? Sometimes. But then I remember that in any timeline, in any reality, you're exactly the kind of person who would eventually fight back. Maybe it took longer in that other timeline. Maybe you suffered more. But I don't think you'd ever have stayed a victim forever. You have more faith in me than I have in myself. That's what partners are for. That evening, we had dinner with my parents and Chenin, who was now 7 and already showing signs of her mother's stubborn independence. As I watched my daughter argue passionately about why she should be allowed to stay up past bedtime, I thought about the daughter I'd had in my previous timeline. In that life, my daughter had grown up watching her mother be diminished, controlled, and eventually killed by her father. She'd learned that women should sacrifice everything and expect nothing. In this life, Chenin was growing up watching her mother be strong, successful, and respected. She was learning that women could set boundaries, build careers, and demand equality. That was the real victory. Not just saving myself, but changing what my daughter would learn about being a woman. 15 years after the cancelled wedding, I published a book about my experience. Not the rebirth part. I framed it as instinct and intuition, but the story of calling off a wedding to a dangerous man and building a life on my own terms. The book became required reading at several military family support programs. I got letters from women all over the country who'd recognized their own situations in my story and found the courage to leave. One letter in particular stood out. It was from Captain Lin Yu, Chun-Wei's former lover. Dear Su Lin, I know we've never met formally, but I wanted to thank you. When you called off your wedding to Chun-Wei, I was angry. I thought you'd rejected something precious, someone I loved. I didn't understand that you'd seen the truth of who he was. Over the years that followed, I watched him become more controlling, more dangerous, more willing to hurt people to get what he wanted. By the time I testified against him, I understood exactly what you'd escaped. Thank you for being brave enough to trust yourself. It taught me to do the same. I wrote back. We were both his victims in different ways. I'm glad we both survived him. 20 years after the cancelled wedding, I was 52 years old, still practicing law, still fighting for victims of institutional abuse and medical negligence. Chun was in medical school, not military medicine, but pediatrics at a civilian hospital where she could practice medicine with compassion and accountability. David and I were celebrating our 18th wedding anniversary when my phone rang. It was a journalist I'd worked with on several military corruption cases. Su Lin, I'm working on a story about Chun and I wanted to get your comment. We've discovered that his mother has been running a campaign to rehabilitate his image, claiming he was unfairly prosecuted, that he was made a scapegoat, that he was actually trying to help patients and got caught up in military politics. I felt a flash of rage. He murdered people. There's documentation, testimony, physical evidence. How is she getting anyone to listen to this? She's focusing on the fact that you called off your wedding to him, and suggesting that started a personal vendetta, that you manipulated the investigation because you were angry he'd moved on. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. After 20 years, she's still trying to blame me for his choices. Will you comment? Yes. Print this exactly. Chun was a criminal who killed vulnerable patients for profit. Su Lin's decision to call off their wedding wasn't revenge, it was survival. And the fact that his mother is trying to rewrite history 20 years later doesn't change the documented evidence of his crimes, or the testimony of his victims. Some stories don't deserve redemption. The article ran with my quote. Mrs. Chun sued me for defamation. The case was dismissed within 3 months. You can't defame someone by stating documented facts about their criminal conviction. But the lawsuit had an unintended consequence. It brought renewed attention to Chun case and the systemic problems in military medicine that had enabled him. A congressional committee launched an investigation into oversight failures at military hospitals. I was asked to testify. Standing in that hearing room, facing politicians and military brass and cameras, I thought about the two versions of myself. The one who'd died at 32, silent and forgotten. And the one who'd survived to 52, speaking truth to power. My name is Su Lin, I began. 20 years ago, I was supposed to marry Major Dr. Chun. I called off the wedding because I knew he was dangerous. Not because I had proof of his crimes. I didn't, not yet. But because I trusted my instincts that something was fundamentally wrong. I described the pressure I'd faced to ignore those instincts, to be a good military wife, to sacrifice my judgment for the sake of tradition and respectability. I talked about the other women who'd made that sacrifice and paid with their lives. The military culture that enabled Chun is still alive, I said. It tells women to be supportive, not suspicious. To trust authority, not their own judgment. To prioritize the institution over their own safety. Until that changes, there will be more Chun More women who die because they were too afraid or too conditioned to say no. The testimony went viral. Military wives groups contacted me to speak at their meetings. Medical associations invited me to discuss oversight and accountability. Victims' families reached out asking for help navigating the system. I'd become, unexpectedly, a voice for people the system had failed. 22 years after the cancelled wedding, Chun finished her medical residency. At her graduation, she gave a speech about ethical medicine and the importance of putting patients before pride. My mother taught me something crucial, she said. She taught me that being a good doctor isn't about prestige or power, or protecting your reputation. It's about serving the vulnerable and having the courage to speak up when something's wrong, even when it costs you. Watching my daughter speak those words, I felt a completion I hadn't known I needed. In my previous timeline, my daughter had grown up damaged by her father's crimes and her mother's inability to stop them. In this timeline, she'd grown up empowered by her mother's strength and her father's genuine decency. David squeezed my hand. You did good, Su Lin. We did good. This isn't just my victory, it's ours. You were patient with my trauma, gentle with my fears, steady when I needed support. You showed me what a real partnership looks like. I just loved you. The rest followed naturally. That evening at Chun graduation party, a young military wife approached me nervously. Mrs. Su, I read your book, and I have a question I've been too afraid to ask anyone else. Ask. My husband is a surgeon at the military hospital. He's good at his job, I think. But he's been acting strangely. Coming home with expensive things he says are gifts from grateful patients. Working odd hours. Getting defensive when I ask questions. She was nearly whispering. Everyone tells me I'm being paranoid. That military medicine is stressful and I need to be supportive. But I keep thinking about your story and wondering if my instincts are trying to tell me something. I looked at this young woman, maybe 26, Chin An's age, standing at the same crossroads I'd stood at decades ago. Trust your instincts, I said. Don't let anyone convince you that caution is paranoia or that questions are disloyalty. If something feels wrong, investigate. Document. Protect yourself. And if you need help, here's my card. I'm not just a lawyer. I'm someone who knows exactly what you're going through. She took the card with shaking hands. What if I'm wrong? What if he's innocent and I destroy our marriage over nothing? If he's innocent, honest investigation will prove that. But if he's not innocent, staying silent won't protect your marriage. It'll make you complicit in whatever he's doing. Trust yourself enough to find out the truth. 3 months later, that same woman called me. Her investigation had revealed that her husband was part of a prescription drug diversion scheme, stealing narcotics from the hospital pharmacy and selling them. She'd reported it to the military police, and he'd been arrested. I kept thinking about what you said, she told me. About how being cautious isn't paranoia. About how I had a right to know the truth. If you hadn't given me permission to trust myself, I might have ignored the warning signs until something terrible happened. You gave yourself permission. I just reminded you that you could. 25 years after the canceled wedding, I was 57 years old when I received an unexpected package. It was from the military archives, and it contained documents related to Chin Wei's case that had been classified during his trial, but were now being released under Freedom of Information laws. Reading through them, I discovered something I hadn't known. Chin Wei had been planning to kill me. Not in my timeline, this timeline, the one where I'd survived. There were emails between Chin Wei and an associate discussing the Su Lin problem, and how to neutralize my credibility after I'd started pointing journalists toward his criminal activities. The plan had been to stage an accident. Make it look like I'd been careless or mentally unstable. They'd even selected the method. A car accident that would be blamed on my supposed emotional instability after the canceled wedding. But before they could execute the plan, Chin Wei's medical crimes had been exposed. The investigation had moved too fast, and he'd been arrested before he could get to me. I'd been minutes away from being murdered, and I'd never known. David found me sitting in my study, staring at the documents. What's wrong? I showed him the emails. Watched his face go pale. He was going to kill you. He was. And the only reason he didn't was because his other crimes caught up with him first. I felt strangely calm. In my previous timeline, he succeeded. He killed me through medical negligence. In this timeline, he planned to kill me through an accident. Either way, I was always going to be his victim. But you weren't. You survived both timelines. I survived this one because I walked away early enough that his pattern hadn't fully formed yet. Because I disrupted his plans before he could execute them. Because I chose myself over what everyone expected. That night, I had a dream about my previous self. The Su Lin who'd married Chin Wei, who'd endured 10 years of abuse, who died alone in a hospital bed. In the dream, she wasn't sad or angry. She was proud. You did it, she said. You learned what I never learned. You chose yourself. You broke the pattern. You survived. I survived because I knew what you went through. Because your suffering taught me. Then it meant something. My death meant something. I woke up crying, but not from sadness. From gratitude for the second chance. For the wisdom purchased through suffering. For the life I'd built on the ashes of the life I'd lost. 30 years after the canceled wedding, I was 62 years old and considering retirement when Chinan called with unexpected news. Mom, I've been contacted by a documentary filmmaker. She wants to do a film about military medical corruption, and she wants to focus on Chin Wei's case and your story. Would you be willing to participate? What kind of documentary? Investigative journalism. She's already interviewed dozens of military families, uncovered new evidence of systemic problems. She says your case was the catalyst that started people questioning the system. I thought about it. 30 years had passed. Chen Wei was long dead. Most of the people involved in his crimes were dead or imprisoned. Was there any point in rehashing old trauma? But then I thought about all the young women who still joined military families, who still faced pressure to be compliant and supportive, who still ignored their instincts because of cultural expectations. I'll do it. But only if we can include the voices of other survivors. This isn't just my story, it's all of ours. The documentary took 2 years to complete. It featured interviews with victims' families, whistleblower nurses, reform advocates, and me. We talked about Chen Wei's crimes, yes, but more importantly, we talked about the culture that enabled him and the changes that were still needed. When it premiered, it sparked a national conversation about military accountability and medical ethics. New oversight legislation was proposed. Support systems for military families were strengthened. Whistleblower protections were expanded. Chen Wei's mother tried one final time to interfere, claiming the documentary was a defamatory attack on her son's memory. But by then she had no credibility left. The evidence was too overwhelming, the testimonies too numerous, the pattern too clear. Her lawsuit was dismissed. She died 6 months later, still insisting her son had been wrongly accused. I felt pity for her, but not guilt. She'd chosen to defend a monster. That was her tragedy, not mine. 35 years after the cancelled wedding, I officially retired from law practice. Chunin had taken over my caseload of military family advocacy work. David and I bought a small house by the ocean, far from military bases and hospitals and courtrooms. On my last day at the office, my staff threw me a retirement party. Former clients came to say goodbye and thank you. Colleagues shared stories of cases we'd won together. My daughter gave a speech about what I'd taught her about courage and conviction. But the moment that stayed with me came from a young woman I didn't recognize, maybe 23, nervous, holding a baby. Mrs. Su? I don't know if you remember me, but 5 years ago I came to you saying I was engaged to a military doctor, and something felt wrong. I did remember. The young woman who'd called off her wedding after discovering her fiancé's drug scheme. I remember. How are you? I'm good. I'm married now, to someone honest and kind. We have a daughter. And I named her Sue after you. She held up the baby. Because you taught me that trusting yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. And I want my daughter to grow up knowing that. I held that baby, that tiny person named after me, and felt the weight of 35 years of choices settling into something like peace. I'd saved myself. And in saving myself, I taught others they could save themselves too. That was legacy enough. That night, David and I sat on our new porch watching the sunset. The ocean stretched out before us, vast and peaceful and full of possibility. Do you ever regret it? David asked. Not marrying Chen Wei, I mean. Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if you'd tried to change him or save him? I know exactly what that life would have been like, I said. I lived it. It ended with me dead at 32, having wasted the best years of my life on someone who saw me as disposable. So no regrets. No regrets. Just gratitude that I got a second chance and wisdom enough to use it. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink into the ocean. Somewhere in another timeline, another version of me had made different choices. Had married Chen Wei, endured his abuse, died from his negligence. That Su Lin's suffering had purchased this Su Lin's freedom. Her death had funded this life. I would never forget her. Would never take for granted the wisdom her pain had taught me. Would never stop being grateful that I'd been given the chance to choose differently. The shocking truth hadn't been that Chen Wei was a monster. That was obvious to anyone paying attention. The shocking truth had been that I had the power to walk away, to say no, to choose my own survival over everyone else's expectations. And that choice had changed everything. Not just for me, but for my daughter, for the women I'd helped, for the systems I'd helped reform. One woman choosing herself had created ripples that spread for decades. That was the real legacy, not defeating Chen Wei, but teaching others they didn't have to be defeated. As the sun finally set and stars began appearing overhead, I thought about that hospital bed where I'd died in my previous timeline. About the nurse who'd held my hand. About the loneliness and exhaustion and bitter regret. And then I thought about this moment, sitting with my husband of 33 years, retired from a career that mattered, having raised a daughter who would heal people instead of hurting them, surrounded by peace I'd fought 35 years to earn. Thank you. I whispered to the version of me who'd suffered so I could learn. For what? David asked. For everything. For being patient. For loving me through the trauma. For understanding why I needed to fight these battles. You never have to thank me for loving you, Sulin. It's the easiest thing I've ever done. We went inside as the evening grew cool. Tomorrow we'd start our retirement properly, sleeping late, reading books, taking walks on the beach. Simple pleasures I'd died without experiencing in my previous life. But tonight, I allowed myself one final thought about Chen Wei and the life I'd escaped. He'd thought I'd forgive him. Thought I'd accept his lies and his abuse and his eventual murder of me because that's what good wives did. He'd been shocked when I walked away, shocked when I couldn't be manipulated or controlled or silenced. The shocking truth was simple. I'd valued myself enough to survive. And in a world that taught women to sacrifice themselves for men who didn't deserve them, that was the most radical choice of all.